Most people think power lives inside government, presidents, prime ministers, and parliaments. But if that were completely true, elections would fundamentally reshape how states operate. In reality, they rarely do. Governments change, yet the same security institutions remain in place. The same intelligence systems continue operating. The same economic networks shape markets and investment. Sometimes the most powerful institutions in a country are barely visible to the public, which raises a deeper question. If governments rule states, why does so much real power often exist outside them? Modern political systems are built around formal authority. Elected governments pass laws, parliaments approve budgets, and courts interpret legal rules. These institutions provide the legitimacy of the state. But legitimacy alone cannot run a country. Running a state requires control over the systems that keep it functioning. In practice, those systems revolve around three core capabilities: force, information, and resources. These are the engines that allow states to operate, and the institutions that control them often sit partly outside the political leadership itself. This creates a structural tension inside many political systems. On one side, there is political authority, the institutions that formally govern. On the other side, there is operational power, the institutions that control the systems that make governing possible. Political leaders may sit at the top of the state, but the institutions that manage security, intelligence, and economic stability often operate on much longer timelines, which means leaders can change while the deeper power structure remains largely the same. The first engine of power is force. Every state ultimately depends on institutions capable of enforcing order and defending the country. Military command structures, internal security forces, and intelligence services. The sociologist Max Weber famously described the state as the institution that claims a monopoly on legitimate violence. But in practice, that monopoly is exercised by specific organizations, armies, security agencies, and intelligence institutions. Political leaders depend on these institutions for protection and strategic assessments, and when leaders depend on institutions for security and information, those institutions gain influence over political decisions. The second engine of power is information and coordination. Inside most states, influence travels through informal elite networks linking government officials, military leaders, bureaucrats, and corporate actors. The sociologist C. Wright Mills described this phenomenon as the power elite. In modern societies, many of the most important decisions emerge from overlapping networks of political, military, and economic leadership. Governments rotate, but networks remain. And that continuity allows influence to accumulate over decades rather than election cycles. The third engine of power is economic resources. Modern states depend on complex economic systems, investment flows, energy infrastructure, industrial production, and financial markets. The actors who control key parts of these systems possess enormous structural influence. Economic power rarely looks like political authority and rarely gives direct orders. Instead, it creates constraints. Markets reward some policies and punish others. Over time, governments learn where those boundaries lie, and once those boundaries are understood, politics begins to operate inside them. Political scientists often explain this through the theory of institutionalism. Institutions accumulate power over time. They develop expertise, build internal loyalty, and control information and resources. Once institutions reach a certain level of influence, they become extremely difficult to dismantle. Political leaders may last a few years, but institutions can persist for generations. Most states, therefore, do not operate through a single center of power. Instead, they function through layered systems. The political layer provides legitimacy. The operational layer provides continuity. Political cycles operate in years, while institutional systems operate in decades. Institutions that operate on longer timelines inevitably gain influence over those that operate on shorter ones. Which brings us back to the original question. Why does real power often exist outside government? Because governments provide authority, but the systems that run the state are controlled by institutions that often outlast governments themselves. Security institutions control force. Elite networks coordinate information. Economic actors shape resources. Together, these systems form the operating architecture of the state, which is why elections can change leaders, while the deeper structure of power often remains surprisingly stable. Because the most revealing question in politics is not simply who governs, but who controls the systems that make governing possible.